Imagine it is the 14th of January, 1974. You're a 43-year-old schoolteacher living in Cincinnati, Ohio. You wake up at 6 in the morning in the house you have owned for 11 years. The mortgage payment is manageable. The savings account holds about $9,000, which took you a decade to build. You drive a 2-year-old Chevrolet. You feel, by most measures, secure. Your salary is $18,000 a year. Not rich, not struggling. You clip coupons on Sundays. You believe in saving. Your mother raised you to believe that money in the bank was money protected, that a dollar saved today would still be a dollar tomorrow. You have heard talk about inflation, about oil prices, about the news from Washington, but you live in Cincinnati, you are a schoolteacher. These things feel distant, like weather happening somewhere else. If you have ever wondered why prices seem to rise even when nobody officially wants them to, why your savings never quite seem to keep up, why the same government that tells you inflation is bad somehow never quite kills it all the way, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. A pattern so old and so consistent that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It has happened in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in Argentina, in country after country, across 100 years of economic history. And it always ends the same way. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Because the schoolteacher in Cincinnati was about to learn a lesson that no one had warned her about. A lesson governments do not teach in schools, do not broadcast on the news, and do not discuss in polite company. And that lesson is this: governments, almost all of them, almost all of the time, quietly prefer inflation to be a little higher than they say they do. Not runaway inflation. Not wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Just enough. Just a steady, moderate, reliable erosion of the value of money. And the reason why is at the heart of this video. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. The reason this pattern keeps repeating is not conspiracy. It is not backroom plotting by shadowy figures. It is something far more ordinary, far more mechanical, and in some ways far more troubling. It is mathematics, specifically the mathematics of debt. Here is the core mechanism. And I want you to picture this clearly. Imagine you borrow $1,000 from a friend today. You promise to pay it back in 10 years. That $1,000 stays fixed. It does not grow with time. It does not adjust. In 10 years, you still owe $1,000. But here is what changes. The value of that $1,000 changes. If there has been inflation in the meantime, that $1,000 buys less than it did when you borrowed it. Your friend gets back the same number, but the real purchasing power of what they receive has shrunk. You, the borrower, have quietly benefited. Your friend, the lender, has quietly lost. Now swap yourself out. Put a government in the borrower's seat. Put ordinary citizens, pensioners, bondholders, and foreign investors in the lender's seat. And suddenly, you understand the entire architecture of modern economic policy in a single image. Inflation is a slow, quiet, invisible tax. It does not appear on any ballot. Nobody votes for it. It does not show up as a line item in a government budget. But it moves money. It moves it from the people who hold savings to the people who hold debt. And no one on earth holds more debt than governments do. Think of it this way. A debt is like a block of ice sitting in a freezer. If you keep the freezer cold enough, the ice never melts. You owe it forever. But if you turn the temperature up just a little, just a few degrees, the ice begins to shrink, slowly, almost invisibly. Over years, the block gets smaller. The debt is technically still there, but it weighs less. And the crucial thing about this metaphor is that the person who owns the block of ice, the saver, the pensioner, the bondholder, also experiences the warmth, but they experience it not as relief. They experience it as loss. Their block of ice is their savings. It is shrinking too. There's another layer to this mechanism that makes it even more powerful as a tool for governments. When inflation runs higher than the interest rate the government pays on its debt, the situation economists call a negative real interest rate, the government is in an extraordinarily advantageous position. It is borrowing money from the public and paying back less in real terms than it received. The lenders, meaning the savers and bondholders, are subsidizing the government's debt, and they are doing so without any formal policy asking them to, without any vote, without any announcement. The subsidy flows invisibly through the price level itself. Governments have known this for a very long time. And the historical record of what they have done with that knowledge is extraordinary. This brings us directly to the first major case in our story. And it begins not with a crisis, but with a victory. The year is 1945. The Second World War is over. The Allied powers have won. But the winning nations are also, at that moment, almost bankrupt. Britain's national debt has climbed to 250% of its entire annual economic output. 250%. That is a number so large it is hard to picture. Imagine owing 2.5 times your entire yearly income on a single credit card. Then imagine you have also just promised to build a national health service, nationalize major industries, and expand social programs on a scale the country has never seen. This was Britain in 1945, and its leaders faced a choice. They could raise taxes sharply to pay down the debt. They could cut spending to the bone. They could default on what they owed. Or they could do something quieter, something that would take decades to fully take effect, but would be almost invisible to ordinary people. They chose the quiet option. Between 1945 and the mid-1970s, successive British governments kept interest rates artificially low, below the rate of inflation. What that means in practical terms is this: if inflation was running at 4% and the interest rate on government bonds was 2%, then the people who lent money to the government were actually losing money in real terms. They were receiving 2% back, but losing 4% to rising prices. Their savings were being quietly eroded. Britain's debt to GDP ratio had fallen to around 50% by 1970. That is a reduction of 200 percentage points in 25 years. The official story credits economic growth, and growth certainly played a role. But researchers at Oxford and institutions like the Office for Budget Responsibility have done the accounting. Financial repression was responsible for a substantial share of that reduction. It was, in the plainest possible terms, a transfer of wealth from savers and bondholders to the government. Done quietly, done legally, done over decades, and done while politicians spoke publicly about sound money and responsible finance. A retired British teacher did not realize the real value of those savings had been eaten away. She did not see a single dramatic event. There was no crash, no announcement, just the slow, patient grind of inflation doing the government's work. This leads to the second part of this story. Because Britain was not alone, not remotely. If a government told you it planned to use inflation to reduce debts, would you consider that a tax? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because the next part changes everything. We move now to the United States. The same story, slightly different costume. When the Second World War ended, America's federal debt stood at roughly 106% of GDP, the highest it had ever been to that point. The government owed an enormous amount relative to the economy. Between 1942 and 1951, the Federal Reserve pegged interest rates at low levels. They directly capped the yield on government bonds and agreed to prevent rates from rising. The reason was straightforward. The government needed to keep borrowing cheap. At the same time, after the war, inflation picked up steadily and consistently. For years, inflation ran higher than the interest rates the government paid on its debts. By 1974, that debt to GDP ratio had fallen from 106% to around 23%. Economists have concluded that the single largest contributing factor was not economic growth alone. It was the combination of financial repression and inflation. The debt was liquidated. The cost was carried by the people who held government bonds and savings accounts. The schoolteacher in Cincinnati was participating in a system designed to extract value without her knowledge, through the quiet manipulation of interest rates and the quiet tolerance of inflation. IMF research calculated that for the US and UK, the liquidation effect averaged 3 to 4% of GDP per year. These are generational transfers of wealth conducted through policy without a single vote cast. Now, history also contains the extreme version where governments lose control of the fire. We go to Germany. The year is 1921. The First World War has ended in defeat. The Weimar Republic faces reparations and supports striking workers by printing money. Between 1921 and 1923, the German currency, the papier mark, lost virtually everything. The exchange rate went from 60 marks per dollar to 4 trillion marks per dollar by November 1923. A cup of coffee that cost 5,000 marks when you sat down cost 7,000 by the time you finished. The German middle class, who had saved carefully in cash and bonds, was obliterated. Landowners and factory owners came through largely intact. Debts became worthless in real terms. When governments lose control of the fire, it becomes a catastrophe for everyone who holds money. Most people will never know what you now know. Hit subscribe for the parts they never put in textbooks. Britain, the US, and Germany all entered periods of enormous debt and used inflation as a central tool. Pull back and look at the pattern. Same mechanism, different outcomes, but the same invisible hand. Argentina gives us the fourth dimension of this story. And Argentina is important because it is not a story from the past. It is a story that has repeated so recently and so dramatically that some of the people who lived through it are still alive. They are still carrying the psychological weight of it today. By the late 1990s, Argentina had pegged its peso to the United States dollar. 1 peso, $1. It was meant to create stability, to kill inflation, to signal to foreign investors that Argentina was a safe place. It was meant to signal they were a serious place to do business. For a time, it worked. The economy grew, the middle class expanded. People saved in pesos, confident that their savings were as stable as the American dollar. But beneath the surface, the government was borrowing heavily. Deficits accumulated, the debt grew, and the peso peg became increasingly impossible to maintain. The reserves in the central bank did not match the fiction. The reserves did not match the fiction that 1 peso equaled $1. In December 2001, the government froze bank accounts overnight, without warning. The measure was called the corralito, which is Spanish for a small animal pen, a playpen. Citizens could withdraw only 250 pesos per week from their savings. People who had spent their lives accumulating savings found them locked. They found those savings locked behind bank doors they could not open. A university professor who had saved the equivalent of $30,000 was trapped. She found herself unable to access her own money. A small business owner with $50,000 in the bank could not pay his suppliers. The protests were immediate and furious. People marched through Buenos Aires banging pots and pans. In the 10 days following the initial crisis, Argentina went through 5 different presidents. The government defaulted on $81 billion in sovereign debt. The peso was eventually devalued sharply. When it was, those savings that had been locked in the banks were converted from dollars to pesos. They were converted at an artificial exchange rate. People who had saved in dollars found their deposits converted to pesos worth 30 cents. They were worth roughly 30 cents on the dollar. By some estimates, savers lost 50% of their real wealth in under a year. Nearly 60% of Argentina's population was living at or below the poverty line during the worst of the crisis. People who had considered themselves solidly middle class were standing in food lines. Now here's the part that connects to our larger pattern. The Argentine government, like all governments before it, had accumulated debt it could not sustainably repay. The options were limited. The options were cut spending severely, raise taxes dramatically, default openly, or find a mechanism to erode the real value of what was owed. Argentina tried to hold the line longer than it could, and when it finally broke, the erosion was catastrophic and compressed. What had been happening slowly and quietly in Britain and America over decades happened in Argentina in months. The mechanism was the same, only the speed was different. Now look at what this pattern tells us about who bears the cost. This is the section of the story that most people find the hardest to hear, because it requires confronting something uncomfortable. It requires confronting something uncomfortable about the economic systems we live inside. Inflation does not hurt everyone equally. It is not a universal tax that falls on all citizens in proportion to their income. It is a targeted mechanism. And over 100 years of economic history, the pattern of who it targets is strikingly consistent. The first category of people who are hurt most severely by sustained inflation is those who hold savings in cash. This includes those in fixed-rate financial instruments, savings accounts, government bonds, and pension funds holding bonds. A retiree who carefully accumulated a nest egg in savings bonds over 30 years finds the interest paid is now below inflation. The interest, fixed at the time of purchase, is now below the rate of inflation. The bond matures and pays back the face value. But that face value buys less than it did the day the bond was purchased. The retiree did everything right, and was quietly penalized for it. This happened to an entire generation of British pensioners in the 1950s and 1960s. It happened to American middle-class savers in the 1970s, when inflation reached 14% and savings accounts paid far less. It happened to Argentine citizens in 2002 in concentrated and visible form. The second category is wage earners. These are wage earners whose salaries do not keep up with inflation. This is perhaps the most widespread and least discussed mechanism. When inflation runs at 5% and wages are raised by 3%, the worker is effectively receiving a pay cut, not in the numbers on their paycheck, which go up, but in what those numbers can actually buy. A factory worker in Ohio in 1974 might have seen their nominal salary increase by 2% that year. This happened while inflation ran at 12%. Their paycheck was higher. Their life was more expensive. The gap between those two facts was a transfer from their purchasing power to the broader system. The third group, and this is the counterintuitive part, is those who hold debt with real assets as collateral. Mortgages, primarily. A homeowner who took out a fixed-rate mortgage in 1965 for $30,000 benefited. They found that by the mid-1970s, after a decade of inflation, the real weight of that debt had dramatically shrunk. Meanwhile, the value of the house had risen in nominal terms, keeping pace with or exceeding inflation. The family that bought the house gained wealth. The bank that issued the mortgage lost real value over the same period. More specifically, the investor who held that mortgage lost real value. The people who come through inflationary periods in best shape hold real assets, land, buildings, companies, commodities, things that exist in the physical world and whose prices rise with the general price level. In Weimar Germany in 1923, industrialists and landowners survived because their assets were real. In the United States in the 1970s, homeowners who had bought property in the previous decade saw their real wealth preserved. This preservation occurred even as savers were eroded. In Argentina, after 2001, those who moved savings into property held on. Those who moved their savings into foreign currency before the crisis also held on. Those who trusted the banking system were devastated. Those who trusted the peso were devastated. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. Before we close, it is worth drawing the line from past to present, because there is a reason this history matters right now. After the economic shutdowns of 2020, governments spent at unprecedented levels. Governments around the world spent at levels not seen since the Second World War. In the United States alone, the deficit hit huge numbers. The federal deficit hit over $3 trillion in 2020, a number 3 times its previous level. Across the developed world, debt to GDP ratios surged. According to the IMF, global public debt reached over $100 trillion. This occurred in the years following the pandemic, representing roughly 93% of global economic output. Economists at Oxford Economics noted that by 2024, the ratio was approaching levels not seen since 1945, and inflation followed. Beginning in 2021 and running through 2022 and into 2023, inflation across the developed world reached levels not seen in 40 years. In the United States, it peaked at over 9%. In Britain, it exceeded 10% at certain points. In many European countries, it ran hot for longer than central banks had anticipated. And something quiet happened in the background. The same thing that had happened after 1945. Governments with enormous fixed-rate debts found those debts getting lighter in real terms. Oxford Economics calculated that Greece, through the inflation of the 2020 to 2023 period, eroded 26% of GDP in real debt. An extraordinary figure, more than had been achieved through years of brutal austerity programs earlier in the decade. The IMF noted that across advanced economies, inflation shaved off between 1.5 and 3 percentage points of debt to GDP. This occurred in the years following the pandemic, not through any policy announced to citizens, not through any vote, through inflation. Was this intentional? Was it planned? That is the wrong question, and it is the question that sends people into conspiracy theories. Instead, we should look for understanding. The correct question is structural. Does the mechanism make moderate inflation convenient for governments? Does it create a persistent, quiet bias toward allowing inflation to run a little higher than the stated target? The historical record strongly suggests the answer is yes, not because officials are evil, but because the incentives are aligned. Paying off debt through inflation is painless for the debtor and invisible in the short run. Paying off debt through austerity is painful, visible, and politically costly. Governments are run by politicians. Politicians respond to incentives. The economist Carmen Reinhart, who has studied financial repression extensively, has described this as a stealth tax, a tax that rewards debtors and punishes savers, especially retirees, a tax that does not require a vote. It does not generate headlines in the way that income tax rises do. Its costs are distributed across millions of accounts. The costs are in amounts small enough on any given day that most people never connect the dots. Now we return to Cincinnati, to January 1974, the schoolteacher with $9,000 in her savings account. Over the following 8 years, from 1974 to 1982, the United States experienced inflation that averaged around 8 to 9% annually. It reached a peak near 14%. Interest rates on savings accounts during much of this period lagged behind inflation significantly. If that schoolteacher left her $9,000 in a standard savings account, she would have seen the number grow in nominal terms, while the real purchasing power of those savings eroded substantially. By 1982, the same $9,000 would buy meaningfully less. It would buy meaningfully less than it had in 1974, not because anyone stole it, not because the bank failed, but because the quiet mechanism had been running, as it always does, in the background. She likely never understood what had happened. Nobody explained the mechanism to her. Nobody told her the government collected her taxes. Nobody told her that the government also, through the quiet management of interest rates, transferred a portion of her savings to itself. Through the quiet tolerance of inflation, the transfer occurred. She saved, the system extracted, quietly, legally, consistently. What does the historical record tell us about those who came through these periods with their financial lives intact? Not the fabulously wealthy, who have access to strategies beyond the reach of most, but ordinary people who navigated successfully. The historical record shows that those who came through sustained inflationary periods largely shared a few common characteristics. They were people who understood, at least intuitively, that holding all of their wealth in cash was not the neutral position it appeared to be. They understood cash equivalent savings were not safe. They recognized that the relationship between the number and the purchasing power was variable. It was variable in a direction that almost always moved against them over time. They also tended to hold assets whose prices adjusted. They held assets that adjusted with the general price level. Real property was the most common. In every inflationary episode in our record, from Britain in the 1950s to the United States in the 1970s to Latin American economies across multiple decades, assets survived. Those who held real assets survived better than those who held nominal ones. A third characteristic was awareness of interest rates. They watched interest rates relative to inflation. People who recognized that earning 3% while inflation ran at 6% was a loss. They were able to make different choices. They did not simply accept the stated interest rate as a measure of earnings. They subtracted inflation and looked at what remained. None of this constitutes a formula. History does not offer formulas. It offers patterns. And the pattern here is unmistakable. Across different countries, eras, and political systems, the pattern holds. Across different magnitudes of inflation, the people who understood the mechanism fared better than those who did not. And that understanding, above all, is what this channel exists to provide. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. The historical examples discussed describe what has happened in the past. They describe patterns observed across different economies and eras. They do not predict what will happen in any specific future situation. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. Every individual circumstance is unique. No historical pattern guarantees any specific outcome for any specific person. This video is not for everyone. Most people will scroll past it. Most people will hear the word inflation and assume they already understand it. But if one person in your life needs to see the mechanism clearly, needs to understand why the system is structured this way, if they need to know who benefits from that structure, share this with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more of this kind of historical clarity. And I will see you in the next one.